Hello everyone, good day. So this presentation is about the deed of sale of a motor vehicle. This will be discussed by Ms. Nuñez, Ms. Adiong, Ms. Santos, and Mr. Fadriquela.
Good day, I'm Ashlie Nuñez and I will be discussing the definition and the functions of a deed of sale of motor vehicle. What exactly is a deed of sale of motor vehicle? In simple terms, it's a legal document that proves ownership of a car is transferred from the seller to the buyer. Think of it as the official receipt and change of hands for your right. These are the functions of it. Number 1. It serves as a proof of ownership. It's the primary document showing that you are the rightful owner of the vehicle. Without it, you can't really prove you own the car. Imagine trying to register your car with the LTO without it. LTO requires a deed of sale to transfer the car's registration into the buyer's name. Without it, you can't legally drive the car on public roads in your name. Number 2, it serves as a legally binding agreement. It solidifies the agreement between the buyer and the seller. It outlines everything: the agreed upon price, the make and the model of the car, the date of sale, and any other special conditions. This helps prevent misunderstandings or disputes later on. It also serves as a protection for both parties. It protects both the buyer and the seller. The buyer is protected from later claims that someone else owns the car. The seller is protected by proving their already transferred ownership, so they're not liable for any future accidents or violations committed by the new owner.
Good day, my name is Angel Joy Amajong and I'm going to be presenting about our answers for letter C and D, which is about the parties and obligations in the contract, as well as the description of the contract. So, we are going to be discussing about who are the parties that are involved in the contract, what are the obligations of the parties, and lastly, what did the parties agree on. So, first we are going to be discussing about the parties in the contract. So, we have two parties in this contract, which is the vendor and the vendee. So, in this contract, the vendor is Saturn Marketing, who is represented by its owner, Mr. Wesley Lau. And the vendor is obliged to sell their motor vehicle to vendee, Miss Joy Ann T. Abyss. So that's it for letter C, the parties and obligations, and who are the parties in the contract. Those are the vendor and the vendee, Saturn Marketing and Miss Abyss. Now let's proceed to the obligations of the parties. So the obligations of the parties is that the vendor or Saturn Marketing is obliged to sell, transfer, cede, and convey the ownership of the motor vehicle to the vendee. And that is what is stated in our sample contract. So it also says in the contract that the vendor assures that the vehicle is free from any and all liens and encumbrances. So what are those words? So first, when we say transfer, it means that um, to pass ownership or rights from one person to another. And when we say cede, it basically means to formally give up rights. And this word is usually used in legal context. And lastly, when we say the word convey, it means to legally transfer ownership, especially of a property or a vehicle. So these words, when used together in this contract, since these words are the words that were stated in our sample contract. So it basically means that um, the seller or the vendor or Saturn Marketing is giving full ownership of the vehicle to the buyer or the vendee, or in short, Miss uh, Miss Abyss. So that's it for the parties and obligations in the contract. So next we are going to be discussing about the description of the contract, or what did the parties agree on when they entered into this contract, or which is the deed of sale of a motor vehicle. So the parties agreed to into a deed of sale of a motor vehicle. So, meaning the parties, Saturn Marketing and Miss Abyss, have agreed on the sale and purchase of a motor vehicle. So, this motor vehicle that we are talking about is a specific motorcycle. And as you can see here in our sample contract, um, the vendor sells and transfers ownership of the vehicle to the vendee in exchange for payment. So you can also see here in the contract that um, there are specific details about the vehicle. So that includes the make of the motorcycle, the model, the engine number, and the plate number, and etc. So these details are clearly stated in the contract. So that means they are um, they are going to be exchanging for a specific motorcycle in exchange for a payment from the vendor. So that's it for letters C and D, which is the parties and obligations, as well as the description of contract. So in summary, the parties in this contract is Saturn Marketing, which is the vendor, and Miss Abyss, which is the vendee. And the obligation of the vendor or Saturn Marketing is to sell, transfer, seed, and convey the ownership of the motor vehicle to vendee. And the vendee is also obligated to pay the agreed amount in Philippine currency to the vendor, which is Saturn Marketing. So next, for the description of the contract, the parties agreed to sell and purchase a specific motorcycle, meaning they entered into a deed of a sale of a motor vehicle. So that's it for my part, and the next one to be discussed is letters E, F, and G. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Rose Santos, and in this video I will be the one to explain the elements and the obligations in a contract of a deed of sale of a motor vehicle. In this contract, we have the three elements, which are the consent, object, and cause. The consent is the mutual agreement of the seller and the buyer, and the object is the motor vehicle, and the cause is the purchase price wherein the buyer agrees to pay to the seller. The obligations are the absolute and simultaneous obligation. In the absolute obligation, the seller will transfer the ownership of the motor vehicle to the buyer, and the buyer will pay the purchase price. In the simultaneous obligation, the buyer will pay the payment to the seller, and the seller will transfer the ownership of the motor vehicle to the buyer.
Good day everyone, my name is Paul Louie Fadriquela, and here are the unique provisions for each contract. Let's start with absolute deed of sale. It is the immediate transfer, irrevocability, and proof of ownership. Next is the conditional deed of sale. These are the conditions for ownership transfer and retention of title. Next is the contract of sale. It is the payment terms, delivery obligations, and immediate transfer. Next is the contract to sell. These are the conditions for future ownership, transfer, and obligations of parties. And lastly is the conditional sale. These are the conditions for ownership, buyer's right to use property, seller's right or non-compliance. And today we're going to compare and contrast each contract. Let's start with absolute deed of sale versus conditional deed of sale. For the absolute deed of sale, it is the immediate transfer of ownership upon signing and payment. It is also irrevocable once executed, and it is the legal proof of ownership. As for the conditional deed of sale, it is wherein the ownership transfer is contingent on specific conditions being met. It is also where the seller retains ownership until conditions are satisfied. Lastly, it protects the seller's interests until fulfillment. Next is the contract of sale versus contract to sell. For the contract of sale, it is the immediate transfer of ownership upon completion of sale. It is also considered executed once the transaction is completed. And for the contract to sell, it is where the seller promises to transfer ownership in the future contingent upon certain conditions. It is also where the seller retains ownership until conditions are met. And for our last topic, conditional sale versus contract to sell. For the conditional sale, it is wherein the buyer receives possession but does not own the property until conditions are fulfilled. And it is also wherein the title can revert to seller if conditions are not met. And lastly, for the contract to sell, it is wherein the ownership is promised to transfer upon fulfilling conditions, often without immediate possession granted. And that's all, and thank you so much.